Women's clothing has taken nosedives, cartwheels, leaps and bounds through different phases throughout the years. Progressive or regressive, they did it to meet the standard of what was right at the time. Whether it be financial, societal, or familial, women's clothing is always changing. Victorian-style clothing dominated women for centuries. But, in the years leading up to the 1920s, a reform movement began to take women out of the Victorian era and into a new type of woman. World War I was a contributing factor to these more risque looks. Clothing became more relaxed out of necessity. Women stopped dressing so lavishly. The skirt began to go mid-calf, making it easier for women to move around and work while their men were gone. This all led to the 20s, which consisted of a love of consumerism and a newfound sexual power. But, as Stephen Sherritt put it in his Journal of Gender Studies, quote, personas were all accommodated to disinterested love, a norm that confirmed that the freedoms of the new woman were still confined within a class system linked to gender. End quote. Virginia Beckley, shown here in her hometown of San Jose, grew up in the 20s and followed the fashion of short hair, skirts, and love of fur. Her sister, Barbara Higgins, recalled that, quote, fur was always around, very fashionable, not the fake stuff like today, end quote. The 1930s fashion was enormously impacted by the Great Depression. Clothing was not as important to the poorest, and they often would sew up any damages on their clothes instead of just buying something new and in season. Women started doing more outdoorsy things, and some women even wore fashionable suits if they were in the business for it. Clothes were all a deeper, softer, boring color, and the look was meant to be sleek. Instead of changing into different clothing many times a day for different events, most women would just stay in their casual house dresses. Clara Bell, shown in these pictures with her friends and family, grew up in the 1930s in the town of King City. In contrast to the 1930s, the 1950s was a much more stylish and expensive era. The nation was better off in wealth now after World War II, that lasted from 1939 to the mid-40s. Because of this, designer names were important. Women would wear bright-colored skirts or long petticoats. Yet again, fur was very popular in this time. Wearing fur meant that you were a very fashionable and wealthy woman. The look of the 50s was very elegant. Also, unlike the bathing suits beforehand, the ones in the 50s began to show more skin and looked more sexual. While only Hollywood stars would be the ones seen wearing the bikinis, most women wore the fashionable strapless bathing suit. The influence on fashion in the 70s was brought about by the easier methods of travel. Women incorporated ideas and images from around the world and would create their very own style. They would also combine new and old trends. Another impact was heaters. Because of them, women were able to leave behind the thick clothes like the petticoat. Softer, more lightweight clothes became the norm. Pants were ever more prominent in the women's society. In the 70s, styles like the bell-bottom pant was very in. After the hippie era of the 60s, the 70s was a very toned-down but rebellious version of the same thing, which leads now to the new version of rebellion, the 80s. Music and the channel MTV, Music Television, had a big influence on the women of the day. Trends like ripped sweatshirts, stockings, and fishnets were all the rage. The clothing was all very bright colored and tight. Celebrities like Michael Jackson and Madonna were the cause of most of the trends. Big hair and high-waisted jeans were very prominent, along with acid-wash denim. Kashmira Ladd, from the website Buzzle, created a list that claims to be, quote, very 80s. Shoulder pads, flats, heavy mascara, stonewashed jeans, leg warmers, mini skirts, leather jackets, hoop earrings, and fingerless gloves, end quote. Because of social and political changes, women of today have more freedom and rights than ever before. They're allowed to be as expressive with their bodies and sexuality and have made it socially okay to be seen as a piece of meat. But is that progressive or regressive?